Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on our webinar Wednesday session for November. Today, what we're looking at is it's our annual conference last week in Warrington, and the theme for our conference was aiming for excellence. So what we're going to do today is we're going to follow on with that theme, and we're looking at aiming for excellence in workmanship and product selection. So we're talking of things like product certification and what have you. My name is Katie and I'm here to look after the sessions today and answer any questions that you may have throughout. If you want to ask a question to us, on the panel on the right hand side there's a question pane where you can just fill in your questions, just type them in and they will pop up to us, and then what we'll do is throughout the session we'll try and answer any questions as we go along, or we may pick up on them at the end if there's a sort of common theme running with the questions. As normal, we're on Twitter, #CABECPD. Your speaker for today is Kevin. He's Deputy CEO here at CABE and looks after all technical matters. And so he'll be talking you through today's session. So good morning to Kevin, and off you go.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning for this webinar. As Katie says, this is sort of following on from a theme we've been developing recently, which is looking at excellence and trying to pick up on some of the key issues for the construction sector when we're looking at issues around quality of work, so product selection and workmanship particularly, and trying to make sure that in actually constructing buildings that substitution or availability of skills doesn't adversely affect the quality of the final build solution and the final product that we hand on to the client, if you like. So when we're looking in terms of what are we looking at for a standard for either a component or a product in the construction process, or for the workmanship in putting that together and combining components to make a building, we have to look at what we're trying to actually pitch for. And increasingly in the industry, we're seeing a tendency that everything falls to the lowest common denominator, and what we tend to design for, what we tend to look for when we're on site and in a completed building, is something that meets the minimum acceptable standards. And whilst that's all well and good, there is an element of, if we aim only to hit the minimum standards, then what we might actually end up doing is falling short. And somewhere in looking to the future of the building and its use and its maintenance, we have to make sure that we've met not only the short-term needs but actually the long-term needs in relation to the building. And that requires us at design stage and during the construction process to have an eye on what the expected lifespan of the building might actually be. And increasingly we're seeing that customer satisfaction is pitching at somewhere quite a long way above minimum acceptable levels, and that customers are actually looking for quite a lot more when it comes to the completed building. The difficult aspect of that is that the customers tend to look for a lot more in the standard of finish and the visible aspects of the building, rather than the nuts and bolts that have gone together that are sitting within the construction that they won't necessarily see. One of the issues we have with construction is how long we expect our buildings to last, and how much or we expect our buildings to be flexible, adaptable and suitable for use even a long while after their original construction. So whilst it might be all nice and good to look at what the future might hold and whether the products are going to last into the future, we also have to work with an awful lot of existing technologies and try and update and renovate and maintain particularly older buildings. And that can mean then that we're dealing with the maintenance and the adaptation of an older building, actually trying to find the components that are compatible with that original construction can be incredibly difficult. And certainly, if you compare it to motor cars, if you're trying to maintain a classic car, you've probably got to have your own workshop with your own lathe and equipment so that you can actually manufacture some of your own components should something go wrong, because you're not going to be able to source them going forward. So there's an element of, when we look at the initial design and the products we're selecting, we need to have an eye to the future and how durable these are going to be. So when we start selecting products and looking at something that we're going to place into a building, we need some form of certification or reassurance that they've got some sort of expected lifespan to them and they will move forward. And in doing that, we do rely on a lot for information provided to us. And obviously when it comes to products, a lot of that information is provided by the manufacturer. And keeping with the theme of comparing to the motor car industry, it's a question of how much you put reliance on what the manufacturer tells you. You know, fairly big brand, everybody had a fair bit of confidence. So when it came to the information being provided by this manufacturer in relation to their product, everybody was reasonably happy that what they were being told was accurate. Yet here we are, 2-3 years down the line now, following a fairly large issue with emissions from engines produced by VW. And it just really goes to show that it doesn't matter what sector you're in, you really need some third-party form of certification rather than relying on just what's provided for you by the manufacturer that explains how wonderful their product might be. If we try and put some of this into a sort of a look at the start of the process, if you like, the minimum standard we're looking for in terms of workmanship and product, then we do have Building Regulation 7, which applies to construction work, but it isn't very specific and it doesn't actually say very much. It's basically saying that if we're doing building work, we need adequate and proper materials, whatever they may be, which are appropriate for the circumstances they're being used, adequately mixed and prepared, and applies, used or fixed so as to adequately perform the functions for which they're designed. And then putting the building together has got to be done in a workmanlike manner. All of those don't give any specifics, don't say it's got to be to any recognised standard, and obviously by using terms like adequate and appropriate, it leaves an awful lot of flexibility in the system for what might actually be suitable. And I think the way I tend to explain that the limitations of Regulation 7 is it comes down to this: perform the functions for which they're designed. So a bricklayer could put together a wall that looks absolutely horrendous in terms of its joints. They could be all over the place, varying widths, out of level. As long as the wall performs its role structurally, the fact that it doesn't look very pretty isn't a Regulation 7 matter under building regulations. And as a result, very few quality items get picked up and considered as a building regulation issue. There are very few prosecutions alongside Regulation 7. And it doesn't really help to give a lot of guidance as to how you comply. There is some guidance in the approved document that goes with this regulation, but again it's pointing at other sources of information, other places to go. And now the prime other place to go at the moment is tied into the construction product regulations. Now the construction product regulations came out of a European directive as part of our membership of the EU. They are now enshrined as regulations in UK legislation. So even following the result of the referendum and the decision regarding Brexit, we would have to specifically repeal these regulations if we didn't want them to stand in place. Having said that, even if as we leave the EU, there is an element that an awful lot of products across Europe and the globe will be being imported for use in the construction process and tested against standard elsewhere. And it may well be that we keep these regulations so that we can acknowledge that if something has been tested against a recognised standard, albeit not a UK standard, it gives us some form of confidence in its use. So the construction product regulations themselves basically require products that go into the EU market that have a relevant European product standard to carry a CE mark and a declaration of how they conform to that standard. Now, if there isn't a regular standard, there's no CE marking, and we have to be very careful at what the CE mark on a product represents, because it may be looking at a particular aspect rather than the whole performance of the product. But to a certain extent, if a product comes with a CE mark against a recognised European standard, it does give us a degree of assurance that it has at least gone through a testing process or an assessment process to make us reasonably confident that it meets a standard. Having said that, some of the declarations are product manufacturer driven, so although it needs a degree of checking, we can at least have a little bit of reassurance. But I think the first thing I would start to say here is if somebody is claiming for any product that they've got to test against any standard or any testing body, what's absolutely critical is that when we look to specify that product for the building, when we look to put it as a component into our construction project, that we make sure the way in which we are specifying it and the way in which we are using it is exactly the way that it's been used in the test. We see numerous examples of somebody coming along with a product, waving a certificate under our nose saying, yes, this is a suitable product for us to be using on this project, and yet the way in which they use the product isn't the way in which it was intended to be used, isn't the way in which it's been tested to show that it's suitable. And to be honest, if you're not using the product in the same way in which it was tested, then the certification is pretty much useless. So the first thing we might start looking for a product is a CE mark. The next thing that sort of runs alongside that when we're looking at the workmanship element of putting that product into the building is to look to see whether there is a similar standard, either an EU standard or a British standard, that actually gives us, if you like, what we would have termed code of practice. In other words, how should we actually be using this product? How do we actually install it? Because it's those sorts of codes that we use to specify the level of workmanship that we're looking at and to set a benchmark for the standard we're expecting to see when we get to site. Increasingly, we're being told there's a deficiency of skilled operatives in the industry. And if somebody doesn't know exactly how they're going to use a product and they're not entirely sure what they're doing, you don't see many operatives on site referring to manufacturers' literature as they're physically doing the work. They will do what they've always done, even if it's a product that requires something perhaps a little bit different. If we're looking at other testing, other things we can accept as a way of being sure that we've got the right sort of standard, British standards are obviously have a set standing. Each country, particularly in the EU, has its own national standards body. In the UK, it is BSI. So in addition to offering British standards in terms of how we go about doing things, how we do design, how we do construction, how we put things together, BSI also do testing and certification. They look at new product development and they will certify products. So again, if something's got a British standard certification to it, it can give us a reasonable reassurance. And obviously once we start looking at testing bodies, looking at materials, they're not just looking at fit for purpose on day one, they are potentially looking at lifetime testing for these materials, or at least to give us a period we expect the material to work reasonably well. The other thing that BSI offer is key mark, which was again a response to an EU resolution, which is a harmonised expression of conformity, allowing a sort of another mark of quality to be attached. BSI and all other testing bodies in the UK really should be accredited by UCAS. It's the only national accreditation body recognised by the government in the UK. So all of the testing bodies that provide you as a specifier or a user of the building with a certificate of performance of a material should be UCAS accredited. It gives us a degree of reassurance in the body that's providing our test certificate, in that they have quality processes and they are carrying out tests appropriately. You will find product manufacturers giving you test certificates from bodies that are not UCAS accredited, and I would simply suggest that in those instances you have to give a lot more consideration as to whether or not that product is suitable, and also to consider why it is that the product manufacturer has chosen to get it tested by somebody who's not accredited in a recognised fashion. So it does give us a degree of reassurance that the testing body is competent and impartial, not driven by what they're being paid by the product manufacturer to produce the certificate. In the UK as well, we tend to see a lot of certification by BRE Global, as well as doing a lot of research projects and providing a lot of information to the industry. They do third-party certification, particularly in relation to things like fire, security and environmental products. They work with the industry, the insurers, things like the Loss Prevention Council, to produce standards for certification for materials as well. So again, if we see something that's badged appropriately, we have a degree of ability to say, yep, this is going to be a suitable product. I suppose when it comes particularly to products, what we're probably most used to seeing in the UK is Agramon certificates. Now, you know, Agramon certificates have been produced for an awfully long time. There are EU equivalents to the British Board of Agramont, but when you get with an Agramon certificate is a certification of how the product can be used, an indication of its life cycle performance, and a degree again of reassurance that it's been tested thoroughly, it can be used, and it's fit for purpose. Agramon certificates tend to give a bit more information. In fact, under the construction product regulations, you can only give another certificate alongside the CE mark if it does give you additional value and additional information. So the British Board of Agramon obviously gives us additional information. It's very specific in terms of whether things comply with building regulations or not. So it's quite good from that aspect. And it will give some information in terms of how these materials should be applied and used. But once again, with all of these issues, we have to make sure that the way it's been tested and the way we're going to use the product is exactly as was tested in the test scenario. So what we tend to see is that people use materials slightly differently than was intended in slightly different scenarios. And I think one of the biggest problems that we tend to see alongside that as well is that as a specifier or a designer, you may well specify a specific product for a specific use, but we end up with an ethos, if you like, in the industry of product substitution, so that when we get to site, what we actually see in situ isn't quite the same product as was specified. It's what the builder's merchant had available that said, oh, it does the same job. And it performs in exactly the same way. And it was available, it was possibly slightly cheaper, so that's what gets used. And it's you know, a very responsible client with their site supervision staff or a supervising architect that's needed to make sure that what was originally specified is actually what was used, if that was the reason that it was specified for in the first place. And as we look at building performance getting more and more critical, particularly in terms of things like energy, ventilation, actually making sure that we don't get substitution of materials because we don't want something inferior to what was specified can be incredibly critical. Now, there are an awful lot of industry-driven standards and approaches as well, and particularly insurance sector. So when it comes to things like fire products and security issues, the Loss Prevention Council will tend to produce standards of third-party certification, not only of the product but the installer, so that the product installed by a particular person is therefore going to be satisfactory. So we see this in some of the industry-driven standards. We see it in some of the BBA certification that certain products are only suitable to be installed by suitable accredited installers. And the more technical things become, the more critical it is that it's actually the installer who has a degree of certification about how they do the work rather than simply the product itself. So it's important to make sure that we've got the right product being installed by the right person. Other things that are happening at the moment, we were told by LABC at our conference last week that they have formed a special relationship with Jewson's, the builders merchants, in terms of products. And some of this is about support to the industry in Jewson's branches and the availability of information. And some of it is the link between registered and accredited details and products and systems that are available in the marketplace. And we see this not only with LABC, but we see it with other parts of the sector as well, that actually getting a registered detail is a way of showing that we are constructing something to a quality. So we have registered details in terms of sound insulation through a national scheme, whereby the materials, the construction, the detailing is pre-registered in advance of the construction, certified that it will comply and meet the minimum requirements, and then there's a degree of self-regulation on site from the site management to confirm that those details have actually been constructed correctly in accordance with the registered detail. And that then brings together a lot of the aspects that we've been looking at. So it looks at individual products, but it also looks at how products work as they're integrated together. So a lot of our jointing details, a lot of our compatibility of materials is taking care of those issues, because we are building to a set detail with set materials. So we have an assured product or a system, and what we're then doing is using site supervision to look at the maintenance aspect to make sure that's carried through and continues through into the finished building, so that we can actually again have a reassurance that things are at least going to hit that minimum standard. Okay. Something else that you may or may not be aware of is that the fact that building information modelling is driving a need for accurate data. In looking to share information, reduce costs, make the construction process more efficient, building information modelling in terms of its drawing, 3D drawing, sharing information between those just in the design and construction process, and ultimately passing on to those responsible for maintenance. It's critical that we've got the right data that goes into that model. There is no doubt that building information modelling is gathering momentum. There is a larger take-up than there used to be, and technology is now meaning that this will become one of the major influences going forward. Again, at our conference last week, one of the speakers was saying that technology is pretty much there in terms of regulatory minimum standards, that what you'll actually do when you come to do a site visit during a project is realistically you'll be comparing the 3D model with what's there on site, which you may well be doing by using virtual reality glasses to look at the 3D model and then comparing it there and then with the actual as-built to determine what's wrong and what's right. But what is critical when we're trying to build up these data models and share the information is that we have reliable comparative data. And to a certain extent, from that point of view, we need to be looking at third-party certified data rather than perhaps just information that comes from manufacturers. Or if we're looking at manufacturers' data, it needs to be presented in a way that makes it comparable, so that we can truly look at the performance of relative products and make an informed decision when we're selecting them. So the BIM task group put together what they called a product data definition, which was looking at a consistent approach to getting product information. So it was there in plain terms with easy to understand data that could be exchanged quite easily. And building on from that, the Construction Product Association is leading the implementation of this into what's now being called lexicon. Now lexicon isn't going to be product certification, and it's not going to be testing. Lexicon is simply that data source. So if you like, it's going to be a library of product information, but it will mean that everything is in there with the same format with reliable data in an easy to understand way. Now 70% of the construction trade associations are already on board with this, and it will rapidly become the case that this will become the one depository of information that people will go to look for when they're looking for key product information. So what do we do if our material isn't tested? The trouble with the construction industry is it is very conservative with a small c in its approach to putting buildings together. We like what's tried and tested. We're not very good at dealing with innovation. And all of these testing regimes can, to a certain extent, stifle innovation because they need a period of testing and reassurance before a product comes to market. But there will be some aspects of the building where there isn't a harmonized European test. There isn't anything in terms of a certificate that we can expect from somewhere else. So we have to make a decision on how we're going to accept it. And there will always be an element of, shall we do a practical test? So in reality, if we've got, I apologise that this is cars again, but if we take it to a building situation, if somebody provides a fire door and we're not happy that it actually looks like a fire door, it's got no certification to it, we can always go and get that individual door tested, which is the equivalent to the crash test, if you like. But what we tend to do is accept something that looks incredibly robust and over the top, or has a very proven track record, even if it hasn't got any test data behind it. So obviously that's our good old friend, the Land Rover in car terms. But in building terms, nobody really goes away and then worries too much about the testing of brickwork, because we've been using brickwork for donkey's years. So we tend to just rely on what we know. But we can always do individual tests, or we can get somebody to do a calculation. But increasingly what we tend to see now is dynamic simulation modeling using 3D sources so that we can visualize how the material is actually going to perform. And with that, models are all well and good, but what's interesting when we're looking at a model is actually the result, the end view, the visualization we get at the end of our computer graphic or whatever is only as good as the data we've put into the front end of the graphic, or the initial information that went into the calculation. So in reality, if the information isn't right or somebody doesn't understand the modeling system, we may still get a failure in the output at the end of that process. But as I said, I think one of the big issues in the construction sector is over substitution of materials. You specify one thing and you get something that's slightly different. It looks very similar, it may be very similar, but there may be cost implications and there may be performance implications. And again, apologies for using an analogy from the motoring trade, but the question on this slide really is, what car is that? Because to be honest, the same body shell and pretty much the same everything else was produced up until a few years ago with 3 different badges on it. 3 different badges, slightly different claims in terms of performance, certainly different prices on the forecourt. And for those of you who aren't aware, that is possibly a Citroen C1, a Peugeot 107, or a Toyota Aygo, and all pretty much the same car. And this, as I say, is the key issue. The need for somebody on site to keep track of all those substitutions of materials so that we can make sure that we are truly getting the performance we were actually specifying. Okay, that's pretty much run through what I was going to run through today. Somewhat unusually, we don't seem to have had any particular questions today. I don't know whether you've picked up on anything, Katie.
No, I've had a couple of things pop up, but they've been more sort of like conversational stuff. So nothing actually in terms of what you have been discussing so far.
Okay, so I think in summing up, what I would say is this sector, this part of the industry of a products and workmanship, is one of those areas that's been mentioned recently in a lot of government type reports. Some of you may have read a lot of articles following the all-party parliamentary group for excellence in the built environment issued a report regarding the quality of new housing. And one of the outcomes of that will be around the standards we're aiming for and the interaction between building control, clerk of works and warranty providers. And I think we will start to see a greater emphasis on the quality of the job rather than just the ability to hit minimum standards as we go forward. Okay, if there are no other questions or comments, then I'll hand over to you, Katie, to sum up.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for your time this morning. And thank you all for joining us. Our next webinar that we're running is on the 7th of December. And as we're now running up into the Christmas period, what we're actually going to be looking at is event safety in schools. As many of you may be involved in sort of school fairs, Christmas parties, that sort of thing. And it's just, if you are involved, how to make sure that these events are safe. So if you'd like to join us, then information is on the website, as are all the rest of the webinars right through to July next year. A little bit of news for you, for those of you who have been with us for a little while, you may have seen on our social feeds. Our webinars have been shortlisted for an award, which is absolutely brilliant. We're really delighted. So Kevin and I will be representing the association tomorrow in London at the Association Congress and the awards dinner. So fingers crossed, but you know, we're really pleased to have made the top 5, and I can see some really kind comments coming in now. Thank you very much. So yes, so you never know. These could be award-winning webinars. But we'll see you next time, and any questions, again, pop them through to us. We'll answer them after this event. That's absolutely fine. And you can record 1 hour CPD. Just pop into your membership record on our website and log the CPD that you learned this morning. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you soon.